the existing and future security threats resulting from strategic competition in the Arctic region and how the United States Coast Guard and the Department of Homeland Security can effectively respond to and address these threats. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I want to thank our three witnesses that are appearing before our subcommittee this morning. Today, our subcommittee will discuss strategic competition in the Arctic region and its impact on U.S. homeland and national security interests. The Arctic is critically important to the United States' strategic interests. The United States is one of only 8 countries globally with territory above the Arctic Circle, so what happens in the Arctic directly impacts the United States and its citizens. Historically, our adversaries have targeted the United States in the high north to undermine our national security. During World War II, the forces of Imperial Japan saw strategic value in occupying the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska, going so far as to seize some islands within the chain. During the Cold War, Soviet aircraft and submarines regularly attempted to breach U.S. sovereign airspace, and territorial waters in Alaska. The United States early warning missile defense capabilities focused on the Arctic as a potential entry point for Soviet nuclear missiles into the North American airspace. Today, we face a growing number of challenges from near-peer competitors. For the last decade, Russia has been building up its military capabilities in the Arctic, including its fleet of heavy icebreakers. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly stated his vision for the Northern Sea Route to become an alternative to the Suez Canal to facilitate faster trade between Europe and Asia. More recently, Russia is foregoing cooperation on Arctic issues with other Arctic states as it continues its illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, thus breaking decades of precedent in which the 8 Arctic states collaborated closely on scientific research, environmental protection, and maritime safety. Additionally, the People's Republic of China, despite having no sovereign territory within the Arctic region, are attempting to stake out interests in the Arctic affairs. In 2018, the CCP declared the PRC to be a so-called near-Arctic nation. The CCP and state-owned entities own and operate icebreakers and other polar-capable ships. And during the last decade, these entities showed an increased willingness to transit their vessels through Arctic waters. The United States cannot afford to ignore this increased interest in the Arctic from near-peer competitors. As sea ice recedes and technology improves, traffic in the Arctic's maritime channels will continue to increase. This will lead to greater scientific research, natural resource exploration, fishing, and tourism taking place in the Arctic region. Additionally, our military relies upon the flight routes through the Arctic to deploy personnel, equipment, and other material to theaters around the world. The United States Coast Guard has an active presence in the Arctic for decades, providing invaluable search and rescue capabilities, patrolling U.S. waters, and upholding U.S. sovereignty at sea. Their presence enforces U.S. customs and laws concerning trade and fishing, and supports the military's sustained presence at bases around Alaska. Coast Guard's icebreakers have long been an integral component of the U.S. government's presence in the Arctic. However, I am concerned with the delays the Coast Guard is experiencing with the new development and deployment of new polar security cutters that will negatively impact the Coast Guard's ability to carry out its diverse mission set and protect the homeland in the Arctic. Going forward, this subcommittee needs to play an active role in ensuring that the United States can effectively respond to threats in the Arctic. I'm grateful to have our three witnesses to share with us their perspective on the geopolitical situation in the Arctic and ways in which the Coast Guard, the Department of Homeland Security, and the wider U.S. government can deter threats and protect our homeland in the Arctic. Thank you again, and I look forward to your testimonies. And now, I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thenadar, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for calling today's hearing. And I thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Good morning to all of you. With a dramatic changing climate and growing aggression from other nations, the Arctic has never been more central to America's national security. Temperatures in the Arctic are rising at 3 times the global average. Ice levels have begun to recede dramatically, creating both environmental catastrophe and conflict over trade routes, natural resources, fishing rights, and global power. I'm eager to learn more about how the melting ice in the Arctic will affect our national security, as well as global economics and competition. The region also provides tremendous opportunity for cooperation, from scientific discovery to international trade. The Arctic is home to almost 4 million people, including enduring indigenous populations whose continued safety, sovereignty, cultures, and livelihoods must be protected. The U.S. Coastal Guard plays an essential role in safeguarding a rules-based order in far north. Investing in a resilient Arctic community through disaster relief, scientific mission support, search and rescue, law enforcement, and community relations, the Coast Guard bridges the gap between the United States military presence and our humanitarian efforts. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard's ice-breaking capabilities are outmatched by our enemies, and rising threats from China and Russia pose a serious risk to American prosperity and security. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on how our nation can invest in the infrastructure and capabilities needed to maintain a powerful presence in the harsh conditions of the Arctic. The Arctic does not belong to one nation, and it is essential that the United States support robust international organizations to foster cooperation in the region. This work has been hampered by non-Arctic nations like China, seeking to profit from illegal fishing and other harmful activities, as well as Russian aggression against Ukraine that has shattered the fragile trust needed to bring diverse nations together on issues in the far north. I look forward to learning more today about the mechanisms for cooperation in the Arctic, including international organizations and how this has been hampered by the growing threats we face. I'm glad to see the committee continuing our work on this subject, and it is essential that Congress continues to invest in the Coast Guard's capabilities in the Arctic, including through robust funding for new polar security cutters. Thank you again to Chairman Jimenez for calling this hearing, and to all of our witnesses. I am excited. I'm looking forward to your testimony. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member, Mr. Thanadar. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Again, I am pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this critical topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Ronald O'Rourke is a specialist in naval affairs at the Congressional Research Service. Since starting at CRS in 1984, Mr. O'Rourke has written many reports for Congress on various issues relating to the Navy, the Coast Guard, defense acquisition, China's naval forces, and maritime territorial disputes, the Arctic, and the international security environment. He is one of the most respected authorities on naval issues and of special interest to this subcommittee, the Coast Guard's icebreaker fleet. Mr. Luke Coffey is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. His work focuses on national security issues in Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic. As a decorated veteran of the United States Army and former senior special advisor to United Kingdom Defense Secretary Liam Fox, Mr. Coffey brings a unique perspective to this field. Mr. Coffey previously testified before the subcommittee in his prior role as director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and we're glad to have him back. Dr. Esther Brimmer is the James H. Binger Senior Fellow in Global Governance at the Council of Foreign Relations. Dr. Brimmer's work focuses on international organizations and transatlantic relations. During her time at the Council, Dr. Brimmer served as the project director for the 2017 Council Task Force Report, Arctic Imperatives, Reinforcing U.S. Strategy on America's Fourth Coast. In addition to posts in academia, the private sector, and with large nonprofit organizations, Dr. Brimmer previously served as the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs and worked on the Department of State's policy planning staff. I thank each of you, the distinguished witnesses, for being here today. I now recognize Mr. O'Rourke for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tenedere, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss strategic competition in the Arctic. With your permission, I'll submit my written statement for the record and, as you requested, summarize it here briefly. In the CRS report on the Arctic, I'm the author of the section on strategic competition in the region, and I'll be happy to discuss various aspects of that topic during the Q&A. The subcommittee asked me to focus my prepared testimony on the Coast Guard's polar icebreakers, which I've been covering in detail since 2008 when I initiated my CRS report on the topic. In connection with strategic competition, it can be noted that the Coast Guard's polar icebreakers don't simply break ice. They're multi-mission cutters that conduct a variety of operations in polar waters. U.S. polar ice operations, conducted in large part by the icebreakers, support 9 of the Coast Guard's 11 statutory missions. In general, the icebreakers conduct and support scientific research in the polar regions. They defend U.S. sovereignty in the Arctic by helping to maintain a U.S. presence in territorial waters in the region. They defend other U.S. interests in polar regions, including economic interests in waters that are within the U.S. exclusive economic zone north of Alaska. They monitor sea traffic in the Arctic, including ships bound for the United States. And they conduct other Coast Guard missions such as search and rescue, law enforcement, and protection of marine resources in Arctic waters, including U.S. territorial waters north of Alaska. Discussions of U.S. Arctic capabilities often note the lack of infrastructure in the region. With their built-in capabilities, the Coast Guard's polar icebreakers act as a form of mobile infrastructure, something that can be seen when the icebreaker Healy, for example, uses its built-in science support facilities to support embarked contingents of Arctic researchers. The Coast Guard testified in April and June that it had recently signed out a new fleet mix analysis that concluded that the Coast Guard will require a total of 8 to 9 polar icebreakers. Prior to that, Coast Guard officials had stated that the service would need at least 6 icebreakers, including 3 capable of breaking heavy polar ice. The Coast Guard initiated the Polar Security Cutter, or PSC, program for procuring new heavy polar icebreakers in its FY13 budget. From FY13 to 16, the program received only minor funding. Starting in FY17, the program has received significant funding, and the first 2 PSCs are now fully funded. The Coast Guard originally aimed to have the first PSC delivered in 2024, but the ship's estimated delivery date has been delayed repeatedly. Given the degree of design completion that GAO has reported, construction of the ship might begin no earlier than 2024? If so, and if the ship takes at least 4 years to build, which might be a reasonable estimate for a lead ship of this size and complexity, then the first PSC might be delivered no earlier than 2028. Admiral Fagan reportedly provided a similar estimate in testimony on the Senate side last week. If the first ship is delivered in 2028, that will be 20 years after I initiated the icebreaker report. Recent substantial cost growth on other Navy and Coast Guard shipbuilding programs raises a question regarding the potential for a possibly comparable amount of cost growth to occur on the PSC program. If there's substantial cost growth in the PSC program, that could raise a question about whether to grant some form of contract relief to the shipbuilder, as occurred in the Coast Guard's offshore patrol cutter program. One option for Congress would be to ask CBO to conduct a more refined analysis of the potential for cost growth in the PSC program. In addition to the PSC program, the Coast Guard is requesting funding to purchase an existing commercially available polar icebreaker that would be modified to become a Coast Guard polar icebreaker so as to help augment the Coast Guard's polar icebreaking capability, and I'll be happy to discuss that in the Q&A. As important as icebreakers are, improving the Coast Guard's capabilities in the region would include making investments in other things as well, including manned aircraft, UAVs, communications, and shore facilities. The current project to make improvements at the Port of Nome promises to improve the Coast Guard's ability to maintain a presence and operations in the Arctic by eliminating the need for polar icebreakers to steam all the way down to Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands to be resupplied before returning to the Arctic Ocean. Chairman Jimenez, this concludes my opening statement, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke, and I recognize Mr. Coffey for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tenedor, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I am honored to speak before this subcommittee on strategic competition in the Arctic. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I will summarize my prepared statement that has been submitted for the record. The U.S. became an Arctic power on October 18, 1867, at a ceremony transferring the control of Alaska to the United States. With a stroke of a pen, Secretary of State William Seward ended Russian influence on North America. In his retirement, Seward was asked what his greatest achievement was, and he replied, "The purchase of Alaska. It'll take another generation to find it out." I think it's safe to say that it's probably taken more than a generation to figure that one out. In the context of strategic competition, the U.S. has 4 primary interests in the Arctic. First, ensuring the territorial defense of the United States. This is what makes our relationship with Canada so important. It also makes Greenland and Iceland the forward operating bases of the North American continent. Secondly, enforcing U.S. sovereignty in the region. In the Arctic, sovereignty equals security and stability. Respecting other sovereignty while maintaining the ability to enforce one's own sovereignty will ensure that the chances of armed conflict in the region remains low. This is why the Coast Guard has such an important role to play. Thirdly, meeting America's treaty obligations in the Arctic through NATO. And finally, ensuring the free flow of shipping and other economic activities in the region in line with international law and norms. In terms of strategic competition, the U.S. faces 2 competitors in the Arctic, Russia and China. Going back to Peter the Great's 2 Kamchatka expeditions, the Arctic region has always held a special place in the minds and the identity of the Russian people. Therefore, focus on the Arctic serves as a low-risk and useful distraction for Russia's other geopolitical shortcomings like we've seen in Ukraine. President Putin is acutely aware of the economic potential of the region. It is estimated that Russia's Arctic region already accounts for 20% of the country's GDP and could grow in the future. Russia also sees the region as vital to its security, and up until Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine last year, it invested heavily in militarizing its Arctic region. In simplest terms, China sees the Arctic region as another place in the world where it can expand its diplomatic and economic influence and interests. China's 2018 Arctic strategy offers a useful glimpse in how Beijing views its role in the region. Running 5,500 words in its English language translated version, the strategy is littered with all of the Arctic buzzwords that we in the West just love to hear. like common interests for all countries, law-based governance, climate change, and sustainable development. The irony, though, is not lost on observers of the South China Sea, where China has shunned international norms to exert dubious claims of sovereignty, or by the fact that China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Even though China's closest point to the Arctic Circle is more than 800 miles away, Beijing refers to itself as a near-Arctic state, a term that is completely made up. In fact, extending Beijing's logic to other countries would mean that Kazakhstan, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Ireland are also near Arctic states. And these are hardly countries one thinks of when we think of the Arctic. Mr. Chairman, there's been many unintended consequences resulting from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the Arctic is no exception. When it comes to strategic competition, there are 5 areas that have been impacted. The first is the Arctic Council. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Arctic Council has all but ceased from functioning. Secondly, there are new opportunities for China in the Arctic. As Western sanctions begin to bite Russia, there are new opportunities for Chinese firms to fill in the gap. But on the other hand, as an observer of the Arctic Council, and with the Arctic Council not functioning, China loses its voice in that international organization. Thirdly is Russia's ambitions for the Northern Sea route. These are being curtailed by international sanctions. Last year, not a single foreign cargo ship used the route, not even one from China, and not a single ship transited the full route from Asia to Europe. Fourthly, Russia's aggression has convinced Arctic states Finland and Sweden to abandon decades-old policies of military non-alignment to join NATO. And finally, there's been an impact on Russia's overall conventional military capability in the Arctic. Open source intelligence reporting tells us that Russia has suffered severe consequences and losses in terms of personnel and equipment in Ukraine by Russian units based in the Arctic. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the U.S. needs to champion an agenda that advances our national interests and devotes the required resources to the region. America's interest in the Arctic will only increase in the years to come as other nations devote resources and assets to the region to secure their interests. America cannot afford to fall behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. I now recognize Dr. Bremer for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statements.
Thank you, Chairman Jimenez, and the Ranking Member Thanador, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify today about strategic competition in the Arctic. With your permission, I will summarize my remarks that have been submitted for the record. The Arctic stands at the confluence of 3 phenomena: shifting geopolitics, climate change, and the far-reaching implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Arctic is geographical, but is also conceptual. Just as the words Indo-Pacific or the South China Sea connote strategic concepts, so too the Arctic takes on renewed strategic importance. The Arctic is America's 4th coast, meaning increased attention needs to be paid to the interlocking strategic, economic, environmental, and social concerns in the region. I will begin by commenting on the geopolitics and the changing institutions in the Arctic. As we've already noted in this hearing, the geopolitics of the Arctic was dramatically altered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Both Finland and Sweden abandoned, in Sweden's case, 200 years of neutrality to join America's most important in a military alliance, and we hope they'll be members soon. Finland's invasion of Ukraine not only enhanced NATO, it also inadvertently stalled competition in one of the Arctic's most distinctive multilateral organizations, the Arctic Council. Founded in 1996 in the afterglow of the end of the Cold War, the Arctic Council embodied the spirit of cooperation. Decisions were made by consensus, and the forum focused on sustainable development and environmental issues. By design, it did not focus on security. Unusual for an intergovernmental body, the Arctic Council also includes 6 permanent participant organizations representing Arctic indigenous peoples. This special facility for interaction is distinctive and should be preserved. Cultural ties span current national borders. At the time of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia, unfortunately, Russia happened to be holding the chair of the Arctic Council. Obviously, the other 7 paused relationships with the Arctic Council. Norway is now chair and seeks to revitalize cooperation in this body. This strategic realignment in the Arctic builds on political shifts that were already evident before the invasion. Recent years witnessed the resurgence of great power competition. The U.S. faces a rising power China and the Russian Federation. And increasingly, countries outside the Arctic have been active in the region. One of greatest concern, of course, is China. But that said, there are numerous observers at the Arctic Council, including Japan, India, Italy, the Republic of Korea, and Singapore. They just joined in 2013 a longer list of members of the observer group at the Arctic Council. But even before the war in Ukraine, Russia needed partners for economic development. And indeed, Russia's need for economic partners creates an opening for China. China invested $90 billion in energy resources, and most of those projects are in Russia. An increased activity by China and Russia in the Arctic is a manifestation of another trend: great power competition in global spaces. In many parts of the world, great powers and assertive middle powers seek access to resources. Access to areas beyond or at the edge of national jurisdiction is crucial for success and in this era of strategic and commercial rivalry. Therefore, the protection of coastlines, waterways, safe commercial transit, and management of marine resources is increasingly important, placing greater demands on the Coast Guard. Fundamental to understanding the geopolitical and economic issues in the Arctic is the phenomenon of climate change. Global warming is occurring quickly in the Arctic. And climate change is important to the geopolitics of the Arctic because it changes access to oceans. Climate change also challenges livelihoods. Around 60% of Alaska natives are challenged by climate change. In conclusion, to advance maritime security in an era of strategic competition in the Arctic, the United States must continue to deepen its commitment to make progress on building a deepwater port in Nome, Alaska, continue the Polar Security Cutter program, and work with the current chair of the Arctic Council, Norway, to sustain mechanisms that are of value to Americans who live in Alaska. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Brimmer. And members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. O'Rourke, how important are these icebreakers to protect America's interests in the Arctic?
I think most people would say that they are central to the Coast Guard's ability to perform its missions in the Arctic. The Coast Guard would not be able to do most of its statutory missions in the Arctic without them. They aren't the only thing that the Coast Guard would need to perform its missions, and I mentioned some of the other things, the aircraft, possibly UAVs, improved shore facilities and communications, but the icebreakers are central to that. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, they can be considered a form of mobile infrastructure. So when we talk about improving U.S. infrastructure in the Arctic, the icebreakers can be considered to be part of that.
Well, how many icebreakers does the United States operate up there in the Arctic?
The U.S. operational polar icebreaker fleet is currently 2 ships, the heavy icebreaker Polar Star and the medium polar icebreaker Healy.
So 1 medium and 1 heavy?
That's right.
How many does Russia operate?
They have about 36 government-operated icebreakers, including 6 heavies, 22 mediums, and 8 lights. Those are the government-operated ones. They also have private sector polar icebreakers, 9 medium and 6 light.
I would think that
add all those together, that's 51.
51, but I would figure that they have a much bigger footprint on the other side of the Arctic in terms of the the miles that they have on the Arctic. Is that correct, or am I incorrect?
That's right.
But not to this level, right? Not this difference.
Russia has about 1/2 of the Arctic coastline. They also have 2 million people living above the Arctic Circle. They have many Arctic towns and communities, and they use portions of the Northern Sea Route that runs along the Russian coast as a marine highway to connect those towns to one another. So they have quite a lot of people and economic activity, and that's reflected in their icebreaker fleet.
How many of those icebreakers kind of operate in our sphere of influence, in our area of theirs?
Their icebreakers operate primarily in their own Arctic waters, although they will occasionally send icebreakers into the central Arctic, for example, in support of taking measurements for their extended continental shelf claims.
How many icebreakers do the Chinese have?
The Chinese currently have 2 polar icebreakers, one that they purchased from Ukraine, if I remember right. The second one was indigenously built. A third one is currently under construction. The 2 that are operational have already made numerous cruises to the Arctic. In fact, one of them, the new one, the Shuilong, has just started its most recent cruise into Arctic waters.
What's Chinese? What do you think that the PRC's aims in the Arctic are? What are they after?
That is a subject of conversation and curiosity and concern among numerous observers. Part of it is economic. Some of it may relate to mining and fishing. Some of it is geopolitical. Some of it may reflect their desire to be a world power and their view that world powers need to be active in the polar regions, including both the Arctic and the Antarctic. The exact mix of China's motivations for its activities in the Arctic and what their end goals may be are a matter of discussion, and those may have shifted as a consequence of Russia's war in Ukraine and the impact that has had on the Arctic in terms of what Mr. Coffey mentioned, for example, in providing more opportunity for China to cooperate with Russia as Russia seeks to respond to its diplomatic isolation in the Arctic from the other 7 Arctic states.
In order for the Coast Guard to conduct its mission, how many icebreakers does the Coast Guard need? And what kind of mix is it?
The Coast Guard has testified that their new fleet mix analysis indicates a need for a total of 8 to 9. That's an increase over the previously envisaged total of 6 that included 3 heavies. So now we're looking at 8 to 9, presumably still including 3 heavies.
Fair enough. Final one observation is that the Chinese, the PRC has fishing fleets around the world, and we're going to be looking at, I sit also on the Select Committee on China, we're going to be looking at those activities. Apparently they're raping the oceans, okay? And so my concern would be the same, they would try to do the same thing in the Arctic region, and so maybe that's part of the reason too, why they want access to those fisheries up in the Arctic region.
And China's worldwide fishing activities are a growing concern, including what is referred to as IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. As conditions in the Arctic change, fish stocks may be migrating further north, and so we have a dynamic situation of China possibly being interested in northern fish stocks and the exact locations of those fish stocks moving further northward in response to warming waters.
Thank you. My time is up. And I recognize a gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Thank you all for being here. I just wanted to note that as our planet warms, obviously, and sea levels rise due to climate change, the Arctic is also melting at an unprecedented rate. The Arctic, we know, is warming, melting several times faster than other regions across the world. And we know that this change is opening up new challenges for all, particularly here in the United States, and certainly opportunities for our adversaries to capitalize on. The Arctic is also a case study in not only how climate change impacts us globally, certainly impacts our way of life, but also impacts our national security. It's also, of course, an economic issue. I represented the ports of Long Beach when I was mayor for 8 years, representing the ports right now, largest container seaport in the United States, the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. And so I know that there's also trade implications when it comes to the Arctic and the dangers around national security and economic security. Now, 40% of our nation's cargo go through the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, and our nation's economic prosperity depends on our ability to remain adaptive in this changing maritime environment. And Dr. Brimmer, I wanted just to ask from an economic growth standpoint, do you agree that the Arctic is also critical to U.S. economic interests, both in terms of new commerce and trade?
Thank you very much for your question. If I may follow up on particularly that, indeed, recognizing the importance of port facilities is crucial to the economic health of the United States, as you mentioned, particularly the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And indeed, as we look at changing dynamics, we see the importance of other regions, and I would note particularly the Arctic. Although we comment on the size of the coastline of the Russian Federation, we know that there are significant resources in the Arctic. The management of those will require careful planning for years in the future. Managing future fish stocks, managing other natural resources will be important. And indeed, because of the rapid pace of climate change, we will see increasing pressures for greater navigation through the Arctic. But that will still be difficult, even if we have the important resources that we all support in order to make it possible to travel in that area. That will continue to be a challenge, and that will be important for the United States.
Great, thank you. So we also have, of course, national security issues here. So the world is rapidly changing, our adversaries are quickly evolving with that change, and it's certainly essential to our national interests and our security of our allies in the U.S. that we're meeting this important moment. Now, we have concerns that our operational capacity and our competitiveness in the Arctic is falling behind both Russia and China. I think that's been mentioned already here today. And so the Coast Guard obviously needs the tools to operate in this new landscape. As has been mentioned, has been discussed also here, Russia's upwards of 40 operational icebreakers while China is mobilizing their commercial shipping capacity. We just obviously mentioned also the increasing that's happening around fishing, as well around the Arctic. The U.S., however, is still operating with just 2 polar icebreakers, and it's the same 2 icebreakers as we know that we roughly had about 60 years ago. Also, Dr. Brimmer, from a NATO perspective, with Finland and soon Sweden's ascension to NATO, am I correct that the Arctic presents a unique opportunity for us to strengthen our global alliances with the other 6 Arctic NATO nations, particularly around global stability, economic prosperity?
Yes, sir. Indeed, this is a remarkable moment for NATO, America's most important military alliance. Indeed, the arrival of Finland brings with us a highly competent country with expertise in the high north, which will be extremely important. Of course, it also brings a land border with the Russian Federation and Finland of over 800 miles, but it also brings this expertise in the high north. This will be increasingly important. Ironically, we're having to go back to look at maps that were so familiar during the Cold War. We're talking again about the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, that area in the North Atlantic, which would be important if there ever had to be resupply for Europe from North America. So indeed, there's both important strategically, yet this is an opportunity for NATO to deepen its cooperation, drawing on the expertise of existing and new members in the defense of our democracies.
Thank you. And I want to, with the time we have left, Dr. Brimmer, in 2017, there was a bipartisan task force on Arctic imperatives that, of course, you helped lead. You made it clear, and I want to quote, that the U.S. needs to increase its strategic commitment to the region or risk leaving its interests unprotected. Now, the task force identified several key goals around the Arctic. How do you think we are doing as a country meeting these goals with the remaining time that we have?
Sir, I would say where our grade is only about a C+ at this point. We have made important developments since that report, in that now there is funding for the polar security cutters, which is extremely important, as my colleagues have pointed out, that the United States has interest in the Arctic and the Antarctic. However, we will need increased investment and in infrastructure and in diplomatic support for these new obligations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ma'am, gentlemen, thank you for appearing before us today. I had the great honor of sitting next to Don Young for 6 years, a congressman that represented Alaska for so long, so many decades. When I came to Congress in 2017, Don favored me, sort of put his arm around me and helped me navigate through the complexities of this bizarre realm. And I came to call him friend. I've always respected my elder, and Don shared great wisdoms from his decades of serving the American people and the people of Alaska. So I would like to jump into Mr. O'Rourke. I'm going to discuss during my time of questioning the significance of the Polar Security Cutter Program and building icebreakers, because Don told me on several occasions that it was one of the most important tasks that we could complete. He considered it legacy stuff to get that done. It was so important that America had presence and dominance in that technology, and we were very much falling behind our potential adversaries in the Arctic regarding navigation. And we discussed climate change. And Don made it clear. Don had been a tugboat captain during the course of his life. He understood the waters, and he said that there's always going to be ice. So regardless of climate change, it's not going to become the Caribbean up there. And so you need icebreakers. The nature of the ice may change, but we need vessels that can navigate effectively with 21st century technologies through Arctic waters. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be citing from, and therefore I'd like to submit for the record, the Congressional Research Service report entitled Coast Guard Polar Cutter Security Cutter Program Background and Issues, updated July the 10th, 2023. Be submitted that for the record, Mr. Chairman.
So ordered.
Thank you. Regarding the fiscal year 2024 procurement request, I fully support it. And Mr. O'Rourke, I want to clarify that because the significance of this program has been made clear to me for 7 years now. And I have very high confidence in the Louisiana shipbuilder, Bollinger, who has inherited that program with the purchase of the originally contracted shipbuilder. So let's jump into the 2023 GAO report. May I do that with you, Mr. O'Rourke? You familiar with that report?
A testimony was the June report from this year that reported on the design completion for the ship.
Okay, they're related. I'm referencing their report from April of this year, which studied the development of the program through September 30th of last year.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And as of last year in September, here's some quotes from the GAO report. They stated that design immaturity and the shipbuilder's inexperience working with the specialized steel needed for hull construction remained the program's top risk. They stated that oversight of the program was hampered due to some shipbuilders' deficiencies. This was the nature of the program I'm just trying to clarify before the current shipbuilding contractor purchased the program and the responsibility of completing it. Is that correct?
That's right, because their data was prior to the shipyard sale.
Roger that. So, in my remaining little bit less than a minute, Mr. O'Rourke, please explain to America and the committee just how important this program is and how significant Congress's support for that program is for the future stability of our nation and indeed peace and prosperity throughout the Western Hemisphere and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that, and I will say that I attended any number of hearings over the year where Representative Young was up on the dais, so I remember him very well as well. The Coast Guard will tell you that the PSC program is one of its top 2 acquisition priorities, along with the Offshore Patrol Cutter program, so it doesn't get any higher than that. And although 2 of the PSCs are now fully funded, we are in the process of funding the 3rd. The program of record includes at least 3 PSCs, so this year's funding request supports the continued funding for that 3rd ship. And as I mentioned earlier with the chairman, these polar icebreakers are central to the Coast Guard's ability to perform its various statutory missions up in the Arctic. Not just icebreaking, although icebreaking clearly is quite important, but the other 8 missions as well that are on the books for the Coast Guard to perform up there.
Roger that. Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Do you require additional time?
I have an additional question, Mr. Chairman. Second round.
Now we're going through a second round. I recognize myself for a second round. I yield my time to the gentleman from Louisiana.
Sir, if I could, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to shift to Russia. I think it's important that we acknowledge that the presence of Russia in the Arctic is historically reflective of their territory, their Arctic territory that they hold. I believe there's along the line of 4 million residents, human beings living in the Arctic area, the designated area, and over half of those are citizens of Russia. Their land mass, I believe they have over 1,500 miles of coastline, or I don't exactly recall, but it's a lot. Like much more, maybe 15,000 miles of coastline. So when you consider the entire weave of coast, the point is that Russia has a right to presence in the Arctic, as opposed to China. And I think it's important, and I would like you all to address this. I think it's important that the United States work with Russia regarding securing trade routes and navigation routes that are emerging as technology for vessels emerge and as the nature of Arctic ice changes. We do not want Russia to partner with China, which we're beginning to witness, and this is a concern to me. So beginning with Mr. O'Rourke, if you could comment, and then we'll go to Mr. Coffey and Dr. Brimmer.
Yeah, I'll just make 2 quick points. One would be to reinforce what I said earlier, that Russia's sense of being diplomatically isolated from the 7 other Arctic states as a consequence of the war in Ukraine has encouraged Russia to increase its cooperation with China in the Arctic. And that is creating new opportunities for China in the Arctic that are above those that they were already pursuing. The other thing I'll note is that even though the war in Ukraine has disrupted the operations of the Arctic Council and has led to Russia's diplomatic isolation in other ways from the other 7 Arctic states, there are still forms of cooperation that continue even in this situation. For example, the United States and Russia continue to cooperate in the regulation of sea traffic through the Bering Strait, in the performance of the agreement that the 2 countries reached about the regulation of that sea traffic in 2018. So there is some limited degree of cooperation underway between us and Russia, even in this larger situation.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. As an Arctic power, as an Arctic state, as you alluded to, Russia has every right, and it's Moscow's prerogative, to deploy military forces, construct military bases wherever it so chooses to, as long as it's on the territory internationally recognized as being part of the Russian Federation. Where the concern lies is when you look at what Russia has done in other regions around the world on its periphery, whether it's in the Caucasus, South Caucasus in particular, in Syria, of course, with Ukraine. That's when there's a concern that Russia might try something in the Arctic. In terms of the idea of...
Let me just interject that we concur that Russian military presence is a threat worldwide. We're specifically discussing the Arctic region, and I ask you to stay focused on that because it's a unique international challenge, the Arctic region.
Yes, as long as Russia maintains its military forces inside the borders recognized as being part of the Russian Federation, it's their prerogative to do what they want with them. The concern will become when they decide to use these forces outside of the borders of the Russian Federation. In terms of the notion of cooperating with Russia, I don't think this is, in any meaningful sense, in the Arctic or otherwise, I don't think that this is geopolitically possible right now. And there is a growing relationship between Beijing and Moscow. But Beijing is very much the senior partner, and Russia is the junior partner. And I know, Mr. Higgins, you asked me to stay restricted to the Arctic, but often these geopolitical issues are interconnected. And that is why a strong Ukraine will equal a safer and more secure Taiwan. As China's junior partner, anything we do to weaken Russia will indirectly weaken China. And China's watching how we respond to Ukraine because they have their eye on Taiwan, and a stronger Ukraine could perhaps deter China from doing something in Taiwan. And then ultimately, this comes back to the Arctic.
My time has expired. We need to move on. Sorry.
Right.
I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again to our witnesses. I just wanted to also just follow up. The Arctic is obviously, we've talked a little bit about the economic impacts, there's climate impacts. We also know obviously national security impacts, which we've discussed. Arctic is also home, of course, to people. And 4 million people, as we know, inhabit the Arctic region today, many of them also indigenous groups. Dr. Brimmer, how does the U.S. Coast Guard and other organizations serve the safety and well-being of those that call the Arctic home?
Thank you very much for the question, because indeed, out of the 4 million people who live in the Arctic, about 500,000 of them are indigenous peoples. And indeed, those include our fellow citizens in the great state of Alaska. And I would like to say that, indeed, that the Coast Guard provides important search and rescue for people who are working on the coastlines. As the coastlines change, there is greater challenge for those, including those who are still subsistence hunters. That is important to have the infrastructure to support the well-being of people who actually live in the Arctic. And if I may combine this point with the earlier conversation about the role of international organizations that support people in the region, the Arctic, in a sense, has layers of international organizations. I will note that whatever the future of the Arctic Council, the ability to bring together indigenous people, including those in Alaska, is important support for those people. And whatever the venue is, that's an important structure to help with human well-being and human security. Thank you.
And also, as far as the Arctic Council, what role does indigenous groups, indigenous peoples play in kind of the international cooperation, within the Arctic Council and after Dr. Brimmer, if anyone else wants to also answer, that would be great.
Indeed, the Arctic Council was unusual among international organizations in that it actually has a structure for non-governmental participation. There are 6 groups associated with indigenous peoples that are part of the Arctic Council. 4 of those groups include people in Alaska, so that they actually have an opportunity to speak and participate in the activities of an international organization, which is unusual and something that is of value to Americans in the state of Alaska.
Mr. Coffey, do you have any additional comments on that?
No, only that I concur that regardless of the future of the Arctic Council, there has to be some mechanism that can help address the legitimate concerns and needs of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic region.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana again, Mr. Higgins. Do you have any additional questions?
I would like to give Dr. Brimmer an opportunity to respond to my line of questioning regarding the significance of some level of cooperative engagement between the United States as a heavy presence in the Arctic with the geographically and population density dominant international presence in the Arctic, which is Russia, as opposed to allowing Russia to develop a relationship in the Arctic with China. Dr. Brimmer, would you respond to that line of questioning?
Thank you, sir, for the opportunity to respond to that important question. If I may, I will highlight particular points. The first is that, of course, the United States and the Russian Federation share important duties of search and rescue, particularly in the Bering Strait. Indeed, that is one of our oldest international principles, is search and rescue, and so both countries take that very seriously. Secondly, I will say that it is beneficial for the United States to work with Russia in international bodies, such as the International Maritime Organization, which is responsible for the polar code that actually governs the requirements for ships in the region. That's an important structure. The third is to say that the Arctic Ocean itself, the center, is the high seas. So in addition to the important activities we've talked about in terms of our territorial waters and our extended economic zone, there's actually a portion that is beyond all national jurisdiction. Again, we need to work with Russian Federation and the other Arctic countries in bodies that manage the high seas. And finally, to say that the expansion of NATO is extremely important in this area, where it will be important that the United States works with our long-standing allies in the Arctic, such as Norway, and our new allies, such as Finland and we hope Sweden, because the work in the Arctic will increasingly take up planning and strategic time for NATO as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bremer. And Mr. Coffey, would you give you an opportunity to comment on the significance of the Coast Guard Polar Security Cutter Program, if you would, good sir.
Yes, it is a key component of America's ability to enforce its own sovereignty in America's Arctic region and to protect our sovereignty from foreign adversaries. It is one component of many that the Coast Guard will use to complete its mandated missions, but it is important. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this important hearing, and all of our witnesses, we appreciate you for being here today. The Arctic's growing strategic importance has made it imperative that America is prepared to confront the unique challenges and opportunities that this region presents, and your experience and expertise is appreciated here today. Mr. Coffey, I'd like to begin with you and return to the questions that you were engaged in with Mr. Higgins. In particularly, you commented on some of the, I believe, common interests in Russia and China in that region, and I was interested in your perspective on whether there is an area where the interests of Russia and China in the Arctic diverge.
Well, thank you for that question. As I alluded to, Russia is very much the junior partner in this relationship. One of the consequences of international economic sanctions against Russia is that Russia has looked for other markets and China has swooped in to take advantage of the situation. Much of the energy that was once exported to Europe is slowly finding its way to other places, including China, and at below market rates. So China understands that it's in a position to benefit in the maximum manner from its engagement with Russia right now. Right now, Russia is so dependent on China that I cannot see a situation in the near future where Russia would become a strategic competitor against China. Certainly not one where Russia would align with us to counter China or try to go against China. In fact, I think it would be completely impossible for the U.S. to engineer such an outcome to the point that we shouldn't even try. And we should acknowledge that China and Russia will be our main strategic competitors in the Arctic region, and we should develop and prepare our national security architecture under that assumption.
Do you anticipate, or foresee any scenario where Russia could attempt to impede our access to the Northern Sea route, the United States or other countries?
Well, international sanctions has actually impeded the use of the Northern Sea route. If you look at data from last year, not a single cargo ship, foreign cargo ship used the route, and not a single ship of any flag made the full journey from Asia to Europe. Russia has claimed that a lot of the Northern Sea route is internal waterways and that certain fees must be paid in order to use this route. And then, of course, you are reliant on Russian search and rescue and Russia's ice-breaking capabilities, and that also incurs cost. So right now, I wouldn't say that Russia is preventing any internationally flagged ship from using the route. They either make it difficult or the geopolitical circumstances, in this case economic sanctions, make it cost prohibitive. The French have actually conducted freedom of navigation operations, the French Navy has, up along the Northern Sea route. As far as I know, that is the only NATO country that has done such a thing, but certainly the United States would be within its rights to do so. But whether or not right now would be the right time for that is a matter for policymakers.
And Mr. O'Rourke, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. What additional insight or perspective would you add to what you've been hearing on this subject?
Well, one of your earlier questions was about a divergence of interests, if any, that exists between China and Russia in the Arctic. There is potentially a latent one in the background that may become more in the foreground at one point, and that concerns the Arctic Council. China in the past has raised questions about the Arctic Council as the correct institution or forum for Arctic governance, because they are more on the outside of that than Russia is. Russia is one of the 8 voting states of the Arctic Council, and so there's a potential for the two countries to develop different viewpoints regarding the continuation of the Arctic Council as the primary international forum for Arctic governance. The other thing I will mention is regarding the Northern Sea route, the Russian legislature has been active. They have passed a new law regarding their regulation of the Northern Sea route that may put Russia more directly at odds with the U.S. legal position regarding those claimed internal waters. And whereas in the past, we may not even have had a basis for having a freedom of navigation operation because there was no excessive claim regarding government ships, that may have changed now with the passage of that new Russian law. And so that is another situation that is worth watching.
Thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anybody have any other questions? Yeah, I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to go back. So the Biden-Harris administration's national strategy for the Arctic region, which was published, of course, just last year, is a vital step in creating a cross-agency plan for the Arctic as it relates to the U.S. Wanted to start off by asking Mr. O'Rourke, several Arctic strategies have been developed in recent years by the White House, DOD, Homeland Security, and the Coast Guard. Not all have been fully implemented yet. And so how useful do you think these Arctic strategies are, and how would you characterize the status of implementation?
I think they're useful as a statement of goals. They, in some cases, may be somewhat aspirational. If you say that a strategy is something that has to reconcile ends, ways, and means, then these documents, like many other strategy documents that come out of the executive branch, may not actually pass the test of being a strategy in that regard of reconciling ends, ways, and means and setting priorities, but they are useful in terms of identifying interests and identifying lists of goals to be pursued and lines of effort for attaining those goals.
Thank you. Dr. Brimmer, what steps do you think the Coast Guard should take to ensure that its Arctic strategy is aligned with the national strategy for the Arctic region?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's important that in addition to the support for the investments we've been discussing for the Coast Guard, that the continued important relationship between the Coast Guard and the State Department and the Defense Department is also important. Indeed, the Coast Guard actually helps extend American diplomacy by the work that it does with other countries, both in the Arctic and around the world. And so I think that's important to continue. And these types of structures that are important are interagency. I will say that back when I was heading the International Organizations Bureau, we used to say we were interagency before it was fashionable. One of the great strengths of the United States is the ability to integrate military, economic, diplomatic, and other forms of power. that has to have an interagency component, which means that resources such as the Coast Guard and the Department of Homeland Security needs to also work closely with our diplomatic community as part of projecting America's interests internationally. Thank
And
you.
also, Dr. Rimmer, lastly, what key efforts and metrics should the Coast Guard include when planning for its own implementation of the national strategy?
Some of the things that should be considered, indeed, are the types of challenges that the Coast Guard faces because America faces them. One of them is, first, of course, defending sovereignty on our coastlines and other waterways. But also, it means economic defense, such as guarding against the illegal, underreported, and underregulated fishing, as another example, and our maritime resources. And so those types of considerations also need to be a part of planning for the Coast Guard on its mission. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anybody else have any other questions? Okay, seeing none, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and for the members for their questions. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing pursuant to Committee Rule 7D. The hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.